The Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Innovation will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on cybersecurity challenges for state and local governments, assessing how the federal government can help. Good afternoon. I want to welcome the panelists to today's hearing on cybersecurity at the state and local level. This is a topic that I believe deserves far more attention than it gets. Since joining this subcommittee, I have found that while we can all agree that cybersecurity is an important topic, it can start to feel unapproachable to people on the ground. As chairman, I want to spend some time looking at how cybersecurity impacts real people, like the ones I represent in the 2nd Congressional District of Louisiana. I know that my constituents work long hours and have hard jobs, sometimes more than one. Many of them are not thinking about phishing emails or ransomware, or whether a hostile foreign government has gained access to the networks that control their drinking water, their transportation, or their medical care. And while the federal government has an important role to play in securing these networks, state and local governments own them. The staffing, structure, and resources available to state and local agencies vary across the country, but many of them are operating with a shoestring budget. And, like federal agencies, they are increasingly being targeted with sophisticated cyber attacks. Time and time again, we've seen that these attacks can be debilitating, taking out the tools and services people need to access health benefits, buy a home, or even call 911. As any city official who has recovered from one of these cyber disruptions can tell you, the aftermath can have a hefty price tag. This is a drain on taxpayer dollars, time, and labor, all of which are in short supply at the state and local levels. We also know that these attacks are becoming more frequent and more advanced. According to the security firm Recorded Future, there have been at least 170 ransomware attacks carried out on county, city, or state governments since 2013, including 20 reported so far this year. That's just the incidents that were reported. The actual numbers are probably far higher. But there's another problem as well. Today we rely on the internet to an extent that we never have before. Access to connected devices and an understanding of how to use them securely is the very foundation of economic mobility. Yet, we also know that many in our communities do not have the same means, access, or opportunity to build a level of comfort with technology. While we talk a lot about how automation might impact the workforce, we talk less about how poor cyber hygiene and low-tech literacy can present a real economic barrier to entry. Right now, studies show that the most vulnerable, underserved among us, low-income, immigrants, or elderly populations are the most likely to fall victim to an online scam or click the wrong link. These mistakes can be costly, especially for someone on the margins. And negative experiences like these may also lead many to steer clear of important online services like online banking, health management tools, or even email. This response, left unchecked, will only serve to deepen economic divides and allow our most vulnerable populations to fall further behind. We have to confront this head on, and I look forward to hearing from this panel on how we might do that. This is not a state or local problem, but a national one, and we should invest accordingly at the federal level. Ultimately, we cannot expect under-resourced, understaffed state and local governments to defend their networks from state-sponsored hackers from Russia, China, and Iran. Toward that end, I am working on a comprehensive package to improve the cybersecurity posture of our state and local governments. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about opportunities to address this important national security issue. With that, I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for witnesses for being here today. It's an important topic that couldn't possibly be more timely, as you all well know. Our state and local governments are prime targets for cyber attacks. A May 2019 report by Record Future found that ransomware attacks on state and local governments increased by 39% in 2018 to 53 attacks. And you know that all too well, Ms. Bottoms. And in the first 4 months of 2019 alone, there have already been 21 attacks, including my home state of New York. In 2018, the National Association of State Chief Information Officers found that many states typically spend only 1 or 2% of their budgets on cybersecurity. Most employ fewer than 15 full-time cyber professionals. It's not surprising, particularly given the burgeoning budget challenges many state and local governments face and the talent pipeline issues we have discussed in previous hearings. It will take work on a collective level from federal, state, and local governments, as well as outside stakeholders to improve this situation. But it is clear that action is needed and needed now. This hearing today is an important step, and I commend the chairman for convening it. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about their ideas about how to help. I will soon introduce a bill, the State and Local Cybersecurity Improvement Act, which will direct the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, within the Department of Homeland Security to develop a resource guide for state and local officials to navigate the challenges of protecting their networks. My bill will also create 2 new grant programs. The first is a one-time grant for state and local governments to identify their high-value assets and system-critical architecture. To protect something, you must know what it is worth protecting. And the second grant program that will be part of this bill will help state and local governments conduct exercises to train, prepare, and evaluate their ability to respond to an attack. Working through an exercise allows the government to identify weaknesses in their current plan and establishes protocols and procedures to be prepared in the worst-case scenarios. My bill will help state and local governments be better prepared to defend their cyber networks. But the work we need to do to address this issue does not end with my bill. This is a collaborative effort. It's Democrats and Republicans, and it's all of you at the table and everyone at every level of government. That's what we're going to need to get this, attack this problem in an effective manner. I look forward to working with my colleagues on this issue moving forward, and I want to thank the chairman and our witnesses for speaking with us today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman from New York yields back. I now recognize the chairman of the full Committee on Homeland Security for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Chairman Richmond for holding today's hearing on an especially timely topic, the cybersecurity challenges in state and local governments. Just last week, Riviera Beach, a small city in Florida, agreed to pay $600,000 ransom demand after hackers crippled city computer systems. Unfortunately, Riviera Beach is not alone. Hackers have been wreaking havoc on cities from Atlanta to Baltimore to Albany and actually many more. These bad actors range from unaffiliated cyber criminals to sophisticated state actors, including Iran, and their interest in breaching state and local networks is only growing. Since the Russian government engaged in a historic campaign to meddling in the 2016 elections, officials at all levels of government have devoted time and resources to improve the security of election infrastructure. For its part, Congress appropriated $380 million, a down payment, for foreign grants to state and local election officials to replace unsecure election equipment, improve network security, and provide cybersecurity training to election officials. Additionally, for 2 fiscal years, Congress has provided the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency additional funding to provide cybersecurity services upon request to election officials. But administering elections is only one of the many important responsibilities carried out by state and local governments. These attacks that have come about have disrupted networks in local police departments, offices that process real estate transactions, and public health department, just to name a few. So I'm looking forward to the testimony from our witnesses today. As a former mayor myself, I understand the problems cities have, and mayors more specifically, so I look forward to Mayor Bottom's testimony. But I'm also eager to hear from the Ms. ISAC, which serves as a cyber threat information sharing hub for state and local governments and spearheads state and local coordination on securing election infrastructure. Finally, I look forward to understanding the desperate impact of cybersecurity incidents on vulnerable populations and how the federal government can partner with state and local government to address them. I thank our witnesses for being here today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Mississippi yields back. I now recognize Mr. Rogers, the ranking member of the full Committee on Homeland Security, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our witnesses for being here today, especially Mr. Salifo from Auburn University's McCreary Institute for Cyber and Critical Infrastructure Security, located in my district. The McCreary Institute serves as an invaluable resource to our state and the nation with its cybersecurity and critical infrastructure work. Cybersecurity is a tremendous challenge facing all levels of government. Our state and local governments have seen firsthand through increased ransomware attacks that leave citizens without services and cities in panic. I'm glad that our hearing today will discuss how federal government is already lending a helping hand and how we can improve the level of assistance. I appreciate Mr. Salifo highlighting the great work we are doing in Alabama to help address these issues, like the Cyber Magnet School to address the talent shortage, and the Alabama Security Operations Center, which provides centralized cybersecurity management for Alabama's state agencies, and I had the honor of visiting there about a month ago. It's pretty impressive. In many ways, Alabama is setting the example for other states as we confront the challenges of cybersecurity. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Alabama yields back. I'd like to remind other members of the subcommittee that under the rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. I want to welcome our panel of witnesses here today. First, I'm very pleased to welcome Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms of the city of Atlanta, Georgia, who oversaw the city's response to a major ransomware attack in March 2018. Under Mayor Bottoms' leadership, the city took a number of bold corrective actions to manage and mitigate damage and prevent future attacks. Thank you, Mayor, for your participation and your willingness to share the lessons you've learned in cyber incident response. Next, we have Mr. Thomas Duffy from the Center for Internet Security, who is currently serving as the chair of the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, MS-ISAC. The MS-ISAC serves as an important partner and liaison between DHS and state and local officials when it comes to sharing information and coordinating around cyber threats. I look forward to hearing his insights on how we might tackle this problem. Next, we also have Mr. Ahmad Sultan, who is here today in his personal capacity to discuss the research conducted while serving at UC Berkeley's Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. His research focused on how underserved residents, including low-income residents, seniors, and foreign language speakers, face higher than average risk of becoming victims of cyber attacks and are less equipped to respond. I am sure that his comments will shed light on an important area of cybersecurity that is typically overlooked. And last but certainly not least, I would like to welcome Mr. Frank Salifo, the director of the McCreary Institute for Cyber and Critical Infrastructure at Auburn University. Mr. Salifo previously served as a presidential appointee in the Department of Homeland Security as an advisor to former Director Tom Ridge. He has also testified before this committee and elsewhere on the Hill dozens of times. Welcome back to the committee, Mr. Salifo, and thank you for your testimony. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with you, the Honorable Keisha Lance Bottoms.
Good afternoon. My name is Keisha Lance Bottoms, and I am the mayor of Atlanta, Georgia, the cradle of the civil rights movement and the 10th largest economy in the United States. Thank you to Chairman Richmond and to Chairman Thompson and to each of you for having me here today. It is an honor to join you. In the early morning hours of March 22nd, 2018, 77 days into my term as mayor and only 4 days into the tenure of our new COO, Atlanta's government experienced a ransomware cyber attack, which impacted our operations and our ability to provide services to our residents and our visitors. To paint a broader picture of that day, the city of Atlanta has nearly 9,000 employees, and it goes without saying that many rely on technology to do their jobs and to keep the city running. We were incapacitated. Fortunately, our daily mission-critical services such as fire, police, and ambulance were not severely impacted, and neither was our water supply. However, some departments and government entities suffered irreparable damage, including our police department, which lost stored dash cam video footage. The Atlanta Municipal Court had to cancel and reschedule hearings. Our customer service interface, known as ATL 311, was knocked offline. Many other applications were impacted or affected, delaying the delivery of city services. As the first day unfolded, it became clear to us that criminals had attacked the city's computer systems, and we moved quickly to mitigate those circumstances. The first few hours of the attack were critical for limiting damage and determining our steps going forward. We notified law enforcement and key partners, including our insurance carrier, our government partners, the media, and the public. We also needed to learn in details what systems, functions, and operations were impacted. That may sound simple, but during an emergency, the process of identifying every compromised system was challenging, especially without the assistance of technology. Out of an abundance of caution, we took some systems offline and hired an outside security firm to assist with our response. We soon discovered that attackers were demanding a ransom payment of $51,000 in Bitcoins to unlock our systems. We refused to pay. The cost of recovery to date has been approximately $7.2 million, and that number is still climbing. Some costs have been reimbursed under our cyber insurance policies, which thankfully, for the first time, we had obtained just a few months before the attack. Last November, federal authorities charged 2 Iranians with the attack and outlined their massive scheme to breach computer networks of local governments, healthcare systems, and other public entities. Our cyber attack was not unique. Digital extortion is now a common occurrence affecting many organizations in the public and private sectors, and cyber threats are becoming much more hostile and frequent. And we must continue to understand how to protect ourselves against these attacks when they occur. The good news is that Atlanta is rebounding from this attack and sharing its experience with other cities. But the reality is that as elected officials, we often make investments in infrastructure that people can see. In my nearly 2-year campaign for mayor, not once did a constituent ask me about my investment in cybersecurity. Following our unfortunate experience, we have been advising other cities to help them better understand the continuity measures that are needed. We are adopting a more flexible and hardened infrastructure using advanced technologies and the cloud to diversify and minimize our risk. We're also emphasizing the importance of cross-functional response teams, including our federal and state government partners. But no city can do this effectively without strong partnerships. Through our process, Atlanta has worked with the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, the Secret Service, and the private sector. The work we did to prepare for the Super Bowl earlier this year is a great example of that collaboration. We are staying proactive so that we can understand and better manage this ever-changing landscape. We've also learned that you can never completely protect your computer network, and quite frankly, that remains our biggest challenge. Atlanta is more prepared and resilient than ever, but we continue to need strong partnerships. Many cities, especially small cities, simply lack the resources needed to develop the safety net that's needed to protect against these attacks. The federal government should also expand programs that share real-time threat information, which is often critical in avoiding and mitigating threats. Also, we should have federal programs in place to provide cybersecurity disaster relief funding that will help offset some of these costs. And lastly, we need your help to ensure the safety and security of the electoral process as city and state governments administer the elections that are the foundation of our democracy. With the support and assistance of partners such as the Department of Homeland Security and this distinguished committee, all of our cities and our country can be safer and better prepared. Thank you.
Adams, for your testimony. His statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Thompson and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Thomas Duffy, and I am the chair of the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or MSISAC, which is operated by the Center for Internet Security. We have a cooperative agreement with the Department of Homeland Security to work with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments across the country. We serve as a focal point for cyber prevention, protection, response, and recovery of the nation's state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. I've spent my career in service to state and local governments, including the past 15 years with the MSISAC. Today, I will discuss the current level of cyber maturity in state and local governments, the major security concerns, and the recommendations on how the federal government can help. Membership in the MSISAC and the more recently created Elections Infrastructure ISAC has tripled in the past year and a half, which is a clear indication that the state and local governments have a growing need for assistance, guidance, and support. We conduct an annual cybersecurity maturity assessment called the Nationwide Cybersecurity Review, which measures the gaps and capabilities of cyber programs of the state and local governments. So what have we learned from these annual reviews? We have learned that the states continue to report a higher overall maturity scores than the local counterparts, not surprising. And while improvements have been noted, there is still much to be done at all levels of government. We've also learned that the same top 5 security concerns dominate this discussion year after year. Number 1 concern in 2018 was lack of sufficient funding. Number 2 was the increasing sophistication of threats. Number 3 was a lack of documented processes. Number 4 was emerging technologies. And 5, as mentioned earlier, is the inadequate supply of cybersecurity professionals. Addressing these challenges requires resources, as well as state and national strategies. We need to increase the pool of cybersecurity professionals, plan for investments in our IT infrastructure, and secure that security is built into the products and services. So what can the federal government do to assist? First, let me note that DHS has been very supportive and proactive in addressing the increasing cyber challenges faced by state and local governments, especially in the election sector. There are 2 areas I would recommend for cyber support. One that requires funding, which you're used to, and one that only requires some interagency cooperation, which would be nice to see. First, the federal government should consider establishing a dedicated state and local cybersecurity grant program. When the initial Homeland Security grants were created, cybersecurity threat is not what it is today. Most of the funds were dedicated to anti-terrorism activities, which was appropriate. Over time, the grant funds have decreased, while the cyber threat has expanded exponentially, and the terrorism threat still exists. Thus, there's a smaller pool of funding for a much larger pool of threats. And more money is going to sustained activities, leaving less money for new initiatives. I would suggest if a cyber grant program is established, priority be given or funds set aside to programs that support state and local partnerships. Leveraging the combined resources of state and local partnerships will serve as a force multiplier and really get the value out of the funds. Second, the federal government should adopt a single audit approach when auditing state programs for compliance with security guidelines with the cognizant federal agencies. In 1984, the Single Audit Act was passed, which proved to be a cost-effective method to audit non-federal entities. Once one audit is conducted in lieu of multiple audits of individual programs, and a single audit standard is applied. The same should apply to cybersecurity audits of state programs by federal agencies. This would save resources both at the state level and the federal level, resources that could be reinvested to improving our cybersecurity posture. While state and local governments have made progress in key areas, so have our adversaries. The dizzying array of cybersecurity requirements has made it difficult to develop effective programs. A lack of funding stalls progress, and a lack of capable talent compounds the negative impacts of ransomware and other attacks. We must do better. In closing, our success or failure will be determined on our ability to work together at all levels of government to evade, counter, or neutralize the endless risks that state and local governments face. Each of these efforts requires resources, time, money, and energy that are currently in short supply. If we are to make the progress required of us in meeting our collective missions, we must work together on this national problem. And thank you for the opportunity to address the subcommittee today.
Thank you, Mr. Duffy, for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Sultan to summarize his statement in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Rogers, Chairman Richmond, Ranking Member Katko, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify on the topic of cybersecurity challenges for state and local governments. My name is Ahmed Sultan, and I'm testifying in my personal capacity as the author of a white paper published by the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, and which was facilitated by the City and County of San Francisco. The findings of my research, detailed in my written testimony, are alarming, but they're not surprising. Underserved respondents in San Francisco, defined as low-income earners, seniors, or immigrants, have poor cybersecurity outcomes. Poor outcomes is a researcher's way of saying that their devices have been infected with viruses and malware, hacked, or phished for money. They don't follow best practices for preventative care, and they don't have enough knowledge about curative care. So for today's hearing, I'll focus on ways in which we can reconcile the macro with the micro, reconciling government's attempts to enhance national security with the plight of individuals and their struggle to use digital devices to improve social mobility. Stated simply, while organizations and governments invest millions of dollars to defend themselves from cyber attacks, a critical part of society is falling through the cybersecurity cracks, underserved and vulnerable populations. This comes at a time when an increasing number of our daily activities are governed by internet services. Low levels of cyber hygiene, which refers to best practices that improve online security, pose serious challenges to the well-being of underserved populations. Fear of cyber threats creates a distinct online experience filled with fear, low confidence, and distrust. It prevents underserved users from taking advantage of economic opportunities on the internet. These include job search services, listing platforms, social networking, and email. These services are crucial to remaining competitive in today's job market. Like a mirror to the physical world, low levels of cyber hygiene and knowledge are associated with low-income households and low educational attainment. Most figures on poor cybersecurity outcomes are also underreported. In fact, most underserved respondents I surveyed and spoke to didn't even know about basic concepts like spam, viruses, or online scams. Internet evangelists had promised a digital reality that would even the playing field across demographics. But today we are replicating the same gender and race-based patterns of inequality online that the existing social structures around us enforce offline. This inequality in outcomes is a form of market failure that governments need to correct. The reason cybersecurity experts adapt concepts from public health literature, like cyber hygiene, is because of the unique interconnectedness of networks and society. Poor cybersecurity practices can cause viruses and malware to spread. This in turn can impact people, businesses, and infrastructure. It deepens inequalities for those already most vulnerable to existing economic and social forces, but also reduces trust in online services for all. Take, for example, the concept of zombie botnets. Hackers can control hundreds of thousands of devices without the device owner's knowledge or consent. They can program them to attack specific targets, including businesses and infrastructure. Even local government staff suffer from poor practices. The increasing frequency of ransomware attacks on local government systems is a testament to that fact, and these attacks are bound to increase as more city services are digitized. The risk of ignoring cyber preparedness is too high. 5G networks and AI systems promise smart cities. Important municipal services will be powered by strong mobile connections and trained machine learning systems. We need to pursue a holistic approach where cybersecurity concerns are addressed at a societal level, much like public health issues. While the underprivileged in society are disproportionately affected and most likely to be targeted by attackers and scammers, awareness of cybersecurity threats and best practices needs to seep into public discourse. Digital literacy is not enough. It needs to be paired with cybersecurity awareness. This is not just a state and local government problem. Cyber vulnerabilities are not bound by geographical boundaries. It is incumbent upon federal, state, and local governments to collaborate to solve the problem. But state and local governments face many constraints to increasing awareness. These include fiscal and budgetary challenges, lack of social and technical expertise, low organizational capacity, and geographically bound networks. Promoting cyber hygiene through trainings, public service initiatives, and public-private partnerships can lead to significant gains in the lives of underserved populations while protecting businesses and government systems from cyber threats. But to achieve these gains, state and local governments will require financial support and guidance from the federal government. It is my hope that policymakers recognize the challenges ahead and rise to the occasion. Thank you again, Chairman Richmond and Representative Katko. I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sultan. We now have Mr. Salufo.
Well, thank you, Chairman Richmond, Ranking Member Katko. Real privilege to have Chairman Thompson here, and of course the great Ranking Member and Congressman from the state of Alabama, Mr. Rogers. It is a privilege to join you today. As we all know, cybersecurity challenges are daunting enough to deal with at the federal level. At the state and local, tribal and territorial levels, where resources and in many cases expertise are in relatively shorter supply, these challenges are exponentially more difficult to tackle. Recognizing this mismatch and taking steps to address it is an absolute imperative. Your leadership in confronting this issue head-on today and in legislation that I'm happy to hear coming from both the chairman and the ranking member that is reportedly under discussion is commendable. For too long, state and local have been an afterthought in our national cybersecurity planning efforts. This must change. States and localities perform many essential functions, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, that affect real people every day, 24/7. And the potential consequences are serious. Bear in mind that cyber threat actors can cause loss of life, property damage, and of course financial loss by disrupting critical infrastructure or using ransomware and other forms of malware. And the bad guys have taken notice, concluding that state and local are softer targets and they are increasingly in their crosshairs. The ransomware incidents that victimized in Atlanta and Baltimore are case in point, but are by no means the end of the story. The scale and scope of the problem is striking. Data on reported ransomware attacks reveal that 48 states and the District of Columbia have been hit. Targets include police and sheriff departments, schools and libraries, health agencies, transit systems, courts, and the list goes on and on and on. No jurisdiction is too small or too large. And while ransomware might be front and center right now, and understandably so, we need to recognize that the cyber threat landscape includes many more disruptive and destructive modalities of attack. Quite honestly, ransomware is at the low end of the most concerning cyber potential attacks we can witness. And cyber attackers will continue to target weak links. It's the bottom line. And cyber needs at the state and local level are truly many. More money, more experts, more tools, more threat intelligence information sharing and awareness, more collaboration between governments and industry, among governments, and regionally, just to name a few. Against this background and backdrop, what should the federal government do? And I think Mr. Duffy hacked my email because my recommendations are very similar to his. Firstly, as things now stand, less than 4% of grant monies from the Homeland Security Grant Program are directed to cybersecurity. This is clearly not reflective of the current threat environment. Congress should enact a dedicated federal grant to shore up state and local cybersecurity capabilities through CISA at the Department of Homeland Security. It should be risk-based, have built-in metrics, and include a level of matching funds, since simply throwing money at the problem is not the answer. Topping the list of needs include identifying highest value assets, exercises, training, and of course technical support. Secondly, CISA should expand its field presence to provide technical assistance and incident response support. In effect, a geek squad for those really bad days, so the mayor could call someone. Three, Pull a page and leverage lessons learned from the emergency management community by building regional approaches to capacity building and pooling of resources and expertise among states to offer mutual assistance. The EMAC model in an emergency preparedness environment has served us well, and I think ought to be replicated and tweaked for cyber. 4, obviously circumscribed election assistance, since trust and faith in the electoral process is the very bedrock of our democracy. And some good momentum here, but we need to continue doubling down and make sure we're ready for the next round of elections. So while I touched largely on technology, training, incident response, and workforce, this is by no means exhaustive. I want to close on a little bit of a good news story, and that is, this is not all the federal government's problem, of course. The federal government can, must, and should do more to support our men and women at state and local. But ultimately, there's a lot of good activity occurring at the state and local level, and I think it should be recognized. One in particular I'm proud of, and I might be biased because I serve as a trustee, but in the state of Alabama, they've created a new magnet school focused 7th through 12th grade for cyber and engineering. This is what we need to do. When we talk workforce, it's not only at the collegiate level, at the places of higher learning like my great university, but it's really at the K through 12 level. And I think we need to be spending more time, more money, more resources to be able to get them and get them young, because they're the women and men who are going to be driving the solution sets going forward. So I've never had an unspoken thought. I can go on forever, but I'll close here. The one thing, Mr. Chairman, I should say is, while I'm testifying on behalf of the McCrary Institute, a lot of these thoughts came from a committee I chaired for the Homeland Security Advisory Council that I was co-chair. I'm just not speaking on behalf of DHS. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Salufo. I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. I will remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel. I will now recognize myself for questions. The first question, I'll just direct it to you, Mayor Bottoms. Historically, cities and states have spent a much smaller percentage of their overall budgets on cybersecurity than federal agencies and similarly situated private entities. A recent study from National Association of State Chief Information Officers shows that most states spend only 1% to 2% of their overall IT budget on cybersecurity. So the question for you would be, in Atlanta, what are the limitations does your city face when trying to develop and implement robust cybersecurity controls, strategies, and resource plans?
Thank you for the question. When we experienced our cyber attack, it was very clear to us that we simply were not prepared. It was not where we had made the necessary investments. People don't see cybersecurity, they see sidewalks, they see potholes, and we were allocating our resources accordingly. And we were also putting patches on gaping holes. That being said, it is the reason that we did not pay our ransomware, because we knew that we needed to build a stronger, safer system. We've allocated resources accordingly, and now there's also an expectation from the public that it's necessary for us to budget for our cybersecurity network in the same way that we budget for other priorities within the city. We are also messaging that to the public, that this is equally a priority and that messaging is a lot easier now because the public has felt that impact. And in many ways, people are becoming very sensitized to cyber attacks. We are continuing to work with our private partners as well. We are very fortunate in Atlanta that we have a very booming tech industry, also with Georgia Tech and the Atlanta University Center. And so there is an interest in helping us in ways that other cities may not have that benefit. But also it's important that federal funding trickle down into our cities to allow cities like Atlanta, and especially our smaller cities, opportunities to purchase cyber insurance, and in the same way that we did, to be able to actually build the system that's needed, because in so many cities, that system simply does not exist at this point.
As a chief executive of a city, how hard is it to retain the cybersecurity professionals and the talent that you need to do this when we have a severe shortage of cybersecurity professionals and the private sector pays a lot more than the public sector? So how are you addressing that challenge, and how can we help with that?
It is extremely difficult for us because we are competing with the private sector, and we really are looking for people and are fortunate that we have people who actually are interested in public service. But funding is always necessary and would be extremely helpful for us to offset and to be able to compete accordingly. We've increased our budget in our DIT department, but it is still not enough, and it is always a challenge for us to attract and retain talent because we simply cannot pay what the private sector pays.
You mentioned it a second ago, and you said that now you're fortunate. And when I look at our cities, and I just take my own for example, that constituents are concerned with sanitation being on time, street lights, police officers, and potholes. The city of Atlanta is now very keenly aware of the threat of cybersecurity. What advice would you have for other mayors who have not been attacked yet, but still face those competing pressures of real brick and mortar infrastructure compared to cyber infrastructure?
You have to plan and prioritize accordingly. We were very fortunate in that it was not our 911 system, but it very well could have been. And ironically, our public may say that they received a bit of a reprieve because they couldn't pay traffic tickets and they couldn't pay their water bills. But that being said, our cities must prioritize and anticipate in the same way that we anticipate for any other major disaster to hit our cities, because really that's what it is. It is simply a disaster when it hits your city.
Well, I see that my time has expired, so I want to thank the witnesses. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Katko, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make a couple of observations before I ask some questions. And first of all, Mayor Bottoms, I want to commend you for having the political courage to stand up to this ransomware attack and not pay the ransom. That takes guts, and I commend you for that. Just out of curiosity, you said there was 2 Iranians that were charged with this?
There were 2 Iranians.
Have they been brought to justice yet, or?
They have been charged. I'm not sure what the status is, but we were very fortunate in that they were actually identified, which is very unusual, as I understand it.
Very unusual, and that's why I'm curious. And were they in the United States, or don't you know?
They were not.
Okay, all right. Well, that's just a great example of the threats that we face. And Mr. Duffy and Mr. Salufo, I think you both kind of touched on this, the importance of the federal, state, and local partnerships. And you know, as a federal organized crime prosecutor, I would be dead without federal, state, and local task forces. And it's really the same concept. The synergistic qualities of having all these different players come to the table and work together under the same roof, there's no substitute for that. They all bring different strengths to the table, and I commend you for understanding how important that is as well. Mr. Salufo, I am very disturbed about the less than 4% of Homeland Security funds grant money going towards cybersecurity. I was thinking back to pre-9/11. We had plenty of alarms out there, and we didn't pay enough attention or prioritize those alarms, and we paid a dear price for that. And it kind of seems like we're doing the same thing again here. We understand that the concerns, the alarm bells are going off awfully loud, and before we have a catastrophic cyber event, we better get our act together and prioritize with more funding and more attention. And on a somewhat smaller but important scale, that's what that bill I was talking about to you all was about. It would develop basically a front page for CISA, so any state or local government could go to that page and understand exactly where the resources are instead of trying to fish around for them. And so that's step 1 of the bill. And step 2 are 2 grant programs for state and local grants to identify high-value assets so you can prioritize what needs to be protected most. and then we can address those accordingly. And the third thing would be is to grant state and local governments, provide grants to state and local governments to conduct exercises, tabletop and what have you, to train, prepare, and evaluate responsibilities. So those are things that I think are important. I'd like to hear feedback from all of you, if we have time, as to what you think about the bill and whether it would help. Mr. Duffy, you could start.
Yeah, I certainly think the bill will be very helpful. Certainly exercises are critical. I can say that DHS and FEMA have been pretty active in the exercise area. They just held a national level election exercise last week. I know some of the House member staffs were participating in that. There is a national cyberstorm exercise coming up. There is a guard exercise coming up. Certainly more exercises are needed. More participants need to be active in the exercise program. I think the state-local partnership is critical. A lot of states, 5 years ago, the states weren't doing much with the local government relative to cybersecurity. That has changed quite a bit. They do recognize that the local systems connect to the state. So local problems can become state problems in a hurry, and state systems connect to federal government. So again, state problems could be federal problems in a hurry. A lot of states, such as New York, Wisconsin, Iowa, have been using the Homeland Security money to help the local governments. I know New York State just released $50,000 grants to the counties, so they're working on that.
Right.
Certainly Wisconsin is doing it with the statewide incident response team, with using members of local government as volunteers. So there's money out there, but they need more of that.
All right, message received. Mr. Slufo.
Well, Mr. Katko, I think the legislation, as you laid it out, nails it. I mean, every one of those items is needed and needed desperately. There's an old adage, policy without resources is rhetoric, but it's more than just the resources. The resources are important. That puts skin in the game. But at the end of the day, you do need to get to the point that you can build the relationships. The Joint Terrorism Task Forces, the JTTFs, those entities are worth more than any weight in gold in terms of building trust between the women and men who have to work together in very tough situations. So I do think that exercises, we shouldn't be picking up the playbooks on game day. We've got to be exercising this beforehand. We shouldn't be meeting the offensive and defensive coordinators on game day. Everyone needs to get to know one another. And while we're doing some of this at the federal level, and Congressman Langevin knows very well, where there's a commission looking at some of how the interagency gets together that we have the privilege to serve on together at the federal level, but that's not anywhere near where it needs to be at the state and local level. So whatever advocacy, count on me being there.
I want to think I'm out of time, but I do want to observe that this is perhaps one of the best qualified panels I've seen in a hearing in quite a while, so I appreciate the witnesses, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member, the chairman of the full subcommittee, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mayor Bottoms, one of the challenges we have as members of Congress, people say, well, if you just give us the money, we can fix it. But our challenge is, do we set parameters or guidelines with the money so that at the end of the day, we can measure how successful the goal has become. So if Congress did somehow get in the business of helping state and locals fortify its cyber systems, do you see any pushback with the resources coming with some criteria by which the money would be sent?
Absolutely not, Mr. Thompson. What I see is it would be welcome because we have a challenge with, one, hiring professionals as we compete with the private sector. Also in having, I believe it should be at least a baseline standard with what our systems and security systems should be in place. For many years, again, we were allocating small amounts of money per our budget towards our system, and we were not addressing the real needs and upgrading in the way that we should. With this cyber attack, it made us allocate a much larger portion of our budget than we ordinarily would have to do something as simple as create the cloud. And I think that with partnership with our federal partners and with the allocation of resources, I think that it will help put cities on a much stronger footing and also create a baseline of standards that many cities may not even be aware of until they are faced with something as disastrous as a cyber attack.
Mr. Duffy, you talked a little bit about this in your comments. You want to share your opinion on that?
Yes, I think anything when they're distributing grant money, there certainly should be conditions relative to how smart was the money spent. Just throwing money at the problem is not the solution. Money has to be, one of the things they need to do is identify what their gaps are, what are their weaknesses, and identify how are they using that money to plug those holes that are in their networks. What are the metrics you want so they can prove that the money was well spent? I just said, throwing the money at it won't solve the problem, but metrics and accountability should go hand in hand with any grants that are out there.
Mr. Slarfo, are you comfortable with the responses that have been received?
Congressman Thompson, absolutely. And I do just want to underscore it is important. We've learned lessons the hard way after 9/11 in terms of how all the funds were dispersed and used. But I think it's now a much more refined process, and I think we need to do the very same with respect to cyber. I mean, we absolutely need the resources, but we need to also make sure we're measuring what matters. And the one thing that I would like to see is a match coming from state and local, that they are committed, that they are willing to put a percentage of whatever outcome of their own resources to maximize the impact. But it's needed.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield my minute to the chair.
I just wanted to make a point, and I'm not needling my colleagues on either side of the aisle, but this goes back to the federal government and our role as the federal government of helping municipalities and others who are, some things are beyond their capacity, whether it's talent-wise or money-wise. And so do you think that we can provide more cybersecurity in this country with less money? Does anybody think we can provide more cybersecurity with less resources?
I would say no.
Okay, can we secure more airports with less TSA agents? No? No. Okay.
I think you can do more. That doesn't mean it's going to be 100% because cybersecurity, it's not an end state.
Well, no, my question is going towards this general thing. When we go through our budget cycles, the mantra is usually we're going to do more with less. And I'm just asking, is this an area that we believe we can do more with less money, just like TSA? And I just wanted to highlight that we have different challenges in this country, in this time and day, and it costs money to protect the American people, and it's not that we just want to spend. What we really want to do is protect our people, their assets, and their resources. And with that, I will recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this hearing. I think this is important. Just to kind of go through one specific item that has come to my attention. Sometimes cities lose control of their data, right? So cities provide municipal services, water service, electric service. They have everybody's address. They've got their phone numbers. They've got their credit card information. Is there a standard or a federal requirement of some kind to tell the consumer, to tell their citizens, hey, we've lost your data, it got breached? Is there some kind of standard out there that I'm not aware of one, but maybe you can tell me that there is? Mr. Duffy, do you know of a standard?
Yeah, well, most states have breach notification laws. So if there is a breach and the breach reaches a certain criteria relative to the number of individuals that are impacted, there's a requirement that they do notify the individuals. Where it gets rather difficult is, say, someone's credit card is compromised by a local town, and they may not have the person's individual address to identify, to contact them. So then they have to work with the credit card companies because they're the ones that have the relationship with the individuals. But I think almost every state, not quite every state, does have breach notification laws.
Did you want to follow up with that?
Mr. Congressman Taylor, I do think, and people have attempted to move toward a national data breach notification law, which I think we really do need because there's lots of confusion. You've seen one state, and that's a good thing. That's what our federalist form of government is. But when it comes to data breach notification, we should have consistency across the board. And I know some of your colleagues have pushed for this for a while. My argument is keep pushing.
Do you think it's incumbent on the federal government to devise standards for cities, counties, subdivisions of the United States government for cybersecurity? I mean, to have a federal standard, hey, you need to respond in this amount of time to this, you need to have this standard of security. Is that something that we should be looking toward doing, Mr. Duffy?
I think certainly the standards should be a goal that folks should strive to achieve. And one of the things we suffer from now, there are so many standards out there. There's so many criteria. Just as I mentioned with the federal auditors, I was just speaking to a state chief information security officer yesterday on this topic. And he told me at the end of April, he had 4 different teams of federal auditors on, all asking different questions. Even the federal government doesn't ask the same questions.
So who are the 4 different teams? Like, where are the 4 different standards coming from?
I can find out for you.
Okay. Mr. Cliffo,
You know, I think that the private sector needs to be part of whatever it is we're driving here. So I think that there's standards that may not only be legislated, but here's the reality is the private sector is on the front lines of this war. Just like how many cities went into business and how many companies went into business thinking they had to defend against foreign intelligence services. It's an unlevel playing field. It is. But the question is, do we have enough to know what a single standard is? I'm not 100% sure. I'm not smart enough to figure that out. But I do think we have a series of them, and I do think, at least with data breach notification, that is something worth fighting for.
Mr. Duffy, I think I cut you off. Did you want to finish?
No, just on the data breach notification, I think the importance of a national standard is that businesses, especially small businesses that are now on the internet and doing business around the country, they now have to understand how to respond to a data breach with regulations in place in 50 different states. And it's hard for them to be able to follow what they need to do if there is a breach when there's 50 different regulations I have to follow.
Okay.
And Mr. Taylor, may I just add, within hours of our attack, we went before the public to notify the public because we didn't know if we were dealing with just a cyber ransomware attack or if we were dealing with a data breach. And we found it extremely helpful to communicate that to the public, and it was appreciated, and I think it gave us a little more leeway. The public was much more appreciative and patient with us during that recovery, so I do think it's helpful.
Thank you. I yield balance of my time to the gentleman from New York.
Thank you very much, my colleague. Mr. Slufo, just a very quick question. As many cities look to become smart cities, including the city of Syracuse, are they also considering, to your knowledge, cybersecurity risks associated with the quote-unquote Internet of Things and additional connectivity?
Well, thank you, Congressman Katko. That is an issue that should keep everyone here up at night.
Indeed.
So smart cities are amazing opportunities, but it also exponentially expands the attack surface and can touch individual citizens directly. That the only way to try to get our arms around this is to bake security into the design, at the early stages, design and planning stages of smart cities. So shame on us if we're not thinking about this, but easier said than done. The highways of tomorrow are going to be paved in silicon as much as they are in asphalt. The reality is this is the future, and to retrofit afterwards is going to be exceedingly difficult, if not impossible. So big issue, great opportunity. Just let's make sure it's not a footnote or an afterthought in our smart city planning.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. I want to thank our panel of witnesses, some of whom are very familiar to me and I've had the opportunity to meet with. So thank you for all that you're doing on this topic. I've covered a lot of important issues, and certainly on the data breach notification, I agree. You know, we're focused right now on a different topic, but I've got a bill in for a 30-day data breach notification, which would be a 30-day federal standard. I think that's something that we should move along. We talk about cyber workforce, of course, and we shouldn't look at this in terms of competition and try to, in terms of how the local, state, or federal government can compete for the talent that is out there. We really need to focus on growing the pie itself, not just our piece of the pie at the local, state, or federal. And that's obviously looking more deeply into our educational system and how we can incentivize people going into this field. But let me go back to what we're talking about and the issue of what's the right balance of state, local, and federal attention support on cyber. So I've been trying to draw attention to and prioritize cybersecurity now for over a decade. And the problems of getting the focus of dollars are unfortunately not new, and they exist across the private sector and the federal government as well. So one of my concerns, though, is that federal investments will supplant rather than complement state and local funding. And I don't want to see that. We see that between with the private sector, even critical infrastructure, where we say the private sector is fine to say, they're quick to say, if you want us to do more on cybersecurity, well, then you pay for it. But everybody really does have a role here. So for the panel, I wanted to ask, how can we better ensure that cybersecurity is a priority for leadership in state and local governments? What will incentivize state and local leaders to make adequate investments in this space?
One of the things that's happening recently with the FEMA grants, I mentioned earlier that we conduct a nationwide cybersecurity review of state and local governments. And right now, participation of that is voluntary. We've had relatively high participation in the state, around 90%, but the local government has been low. And that's intended to identify the gaps in the capabilities where they should be investing their money. With the new Homeland Security grant funding, there's a new requirement that recipients and subrecipients must take the nationwide cybersecurity review to identify where their gaps are, where their investments should be made. The nice thing about it, it's a confidential assessment, so the information on the assessment goes to them to help them develop a strategy where they should be making their investments. And I certainly share your concern on it should not supplant funds, it should be for new initiatives. That's always something that I think it's real difficult for the guidance writers, but I defer to them on how they get that in there.
Anybody else on the panel get a comment?
Congressman Langevin.
Congressman, I think that's a really good question. And I have previously worked very closely with the City and County of San Francisco's administration, especially with their digital staff. And I think if the city administrations began having a frank conversation with the digital staff that work for the cities, they would understand that they're highly unequipped at this moment to deal with massive amounts of cyber attacks that are happening on a daily basis. Right now, the cybersecurity staff are not solely focused on cybersecurity. They usually have dual roles, and cybersecurity is usually a secondary role. And so when they begin working and focusing on cybersecurity, they have to read documents that range between 300 to 500 pages. These are referred to as NIST documents that provide standards for cybersecurity. And so when you look at these overworked staff that have to deal with cybersecurity standards, it can be incredibly cumbersome, frustrating, and difficult to deal with if the city isn't focusing and providing sole cybersecurity staff.
As one of the panelists mentioned, I think matching funds in the same way that we seek matching funds for transportation and infrastructure projects, I think that would be a great incentive for cities because we are making the investments, but often not enough. But I think any opportunity for us to have matching funding will also encourage us to invest more on our end.
I completely agree. Yeah.
Congressman Langevin, I was just going to bring up that other point, but also in the opening statement by Ranking Member Katko, I think you said it was 1 or 2% of the IT spend is going towards security. Best practice in the private sector is 8 to 11%. So we really do need to bridge that gap there, and I think Mayor Lance Bottoms said it straight up, and the reality of matching funds would go a long way. And I think it's also great that you have the executive testifying, not the CISO. And because ultimately cybersecurity is an executive issue. It's not going to be relegated to the IT department. That's important, but it's ultimately understanding how cyber fits into the risk of the company, country, or city.
Very good. Thank you all for your answers and your attention to this, and I agree with a lot of what has been said. So thank you very much, and Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
The gentleman from Rhode Island yields back. Before I recognize the gentlelady from New York, Mayor Bottoms, I understand you have a hard 4:15 stop.
Okay.
So let me just, before you get up, ask the gentlelady from Illinois and New York, did either of you have a specific question for the mayor? Well, with that, Madam Mayor, thank you for leaving your busy city and coming up here to provide valuable insight to this committee. So with that, we will just pause and give you a second to break. We don't want you to miss your plane back to Atlanta.
Thank you.
And the Saints and the Falcons will see each other twice this year. I now recognize the gentlelady from New York, Mrs. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this question is for any or all of you. The ranking member, Mr. Katko, and I recently wrote to the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority expressing concerns over the possibility of buying subway rail cars from a Chinese state-owned entity. We did that because we were concerned that state and local governments don't have the proper resources to prepare for the threats posed by state actors, since these types of national security decisions have typically taken place at the federal level. How do we address this issue of the supply chain issue at the local and state level?
Ms. Rice, I'll take first crack.
Sure, go ahead. I'll be glad to.
So I testified recently before Transportation and Infrastructure on the CRRC and state-owned enterprises and the concerns that poses for the country, and I think there are genuine, real risks, especially when we start thinking about ZTE, Huawei, 5G. This is going to be the underpinning of modern societies, and we don't want it built on quicksand. So I think these are big issues. It took Congress, though, to help bridge a gap because Huawei's cheap. It's much cheaper. And when you're in a city and a community and you want to do all you can for your citizens, you're going to find the most cost-effective way to do that. So you raise a really good question.
Well, it's hard to ignore that, though, Mr.
Impossible
Salufo,
to
because
ignore.
they always come in the lowest bid, always.
And they're subsidized on
Right,
top of it.
right.
So, and they've got concessionary financing on top of that. So it's a triple whammy against some of these states. But I think when the federal government takes strong actions to ban certain technologies, that should be a nod towards state and local as well.
Well, I
At least for
totally,
federal grants.
yeah, I agree with you, and so hopefully we're going to get some answers there. Mr. Salufo, Mr. Sultan, you mentioned this in your written testimony, and Mr. Salufo, you referred to the magnet school for 7th through 12th graders. Can you just talk more about that? Because I think one of the biggest problems that we have in this field, on top of the funding, and you've all alluded to this as well, is the talent pool. And we have to start building a talent pool because these issues are not going to go away. So can you explain, Mr. Salufo, a little bit more about this magnet school? Do we have to be, and I understand that education and curriculum issues are run at the state level, but should this be mandatory, a mandatory curriculum?
Be very brief, because I'm sure Mr. Sultan has some thoughts, but I'm very proud of this magnet school because we do need to get them younger. I used to run an MBA with the focus on cybersecurity, and I'd bring my students to a residency overseas in Estonia. And in Estonia, you've got a small country, and I think you've been on a CODEL
Oh, yeah, yeah.
with Mr. McCall.
Right.
They're teaching coding at kindergarten. So, and then once you start hitting gymnasium or high school, they're already going into that particular. We need something similar here. So we need to make sure that everyone is cyber aware and savvy. So we've got to integrate cyber into all existing curricula. And then we need more ninjas. We do need more very deep cyber expert workforce, but we need both. And I'm really, and not just because we need more women, not only in STEM, but in cyber. Quite honestly,
Amen to
my
that.
students, they were the strongest in some of it, but we really do need to attract different types of students to be part of that solution set. We're just missing out on too much talent.
Well, we're just starting with the whole STEM, reaching out to young girls, well, not just, but, you know, within the last 5 to 10 years, and this should be added to that, for sure.
At the top of that list.
Yes. Mr. Sultan?
I just want to add that cybersecurity trainings are incredibly difficult to accomplish successfully. What happens is that often people become more scared after cybersecurity training. A lot of trainers use fair appeals very effectively and very ineffectively a lot of times. And so what happens is that the participants of these trainings become so afraid. There's a lot of literature on how cybersecurity trainings fail, that they begin to withdraw from using the internet. They begin to withdraw from using key internet services that could enrich their own lives. And so
And how do you address that issue? I mean, it is what it is. It's frightening.
it is frightening, but I think a lot of participants, at least those that I've interviewed and surveyed personally, fall on a spectrum of confidence and trust. And if you understand where they fall on that spectrum, you can actually change it very easily. So often at times, participants can have over low confidence that is below their actual understanding and skill level. And so you can actually correct that through measures by trying to discuss with them what their cultural understanding, their background of cybersecurity is, where they get resources, how they can improve those resources, and overall improve their understanding of a realistic threat assessment as opposed to exaggerating the threat assessment, which a lot of trainers do.
Very interesting point. I have a lot more questions, but my time is up. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Now the gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for calling today's hearing on this critically important topic. Cybersecurity is a challenge for state and local governments across America, but the suburban and rural communities that I represent in Northern Illinois don't have the resources that big cities have, and as such are at an increased risk of cybersecurity attacks. A city official told us that he relies heavily on informal networks with other city officials and on professional IT associations such as GMIS International to ensure that the city's cybersecurity needs are met. Mr. Sultan, in your testimony, you referenced concerns for cybersecurity inequality between rural and urban or suburban communities. What steps could the federal government take to bridge this inequality gap?
The federal government could support local governments, understanding where the baseline is for those rural areas, and especially the urban areas as well. Figure out how low-income households and how low-income communities fare in terms of their understanding and skill level in cybersecurity. They can conduct surveys to better gauge where those populations fall. And then they can actually conduct trainings. They can actually partner with private technology companies to provide software updates to phones that are outdated. They can provide system-level support. They can facilitate trainings with the private technology companies, but not to supplant the federal government's networks with the populations, because you don't want the private technology companies determining what those trainings look like. So there are a host of options for the federal and local governments to improve and understand their population's cybersecurity needs.
Thank you. And do you have any recommendations for rural communities that are just the beginning stages for setting up their infrastructure? You know, the idea that a local community would even know which private company to approach is something that I think we sort of take for granted for people that are just beginning to bolster their capabilities.
That's an excellent point, and I think that's where the federal government can play a really important role, because the federal government has the ability and the opportunity to connect with these private technology companies in ways that are far more holistic and centralized than local governments can. They can also create public awareness campaigns, push them out into schools, push them out into television, on social media platforms, on radio. Because without a public awareness campaign, people aren't going to be very interested in even participating in those trainings. I had to use a lot of incentives to get vulnerable populations to even come to discuss their needs about cybersecurity. So if you offer a training, the chances are they might not appear.
Right. Do you have any advice for local governments to better educate their communities on the appropriate personal cybersecurity best practices?
I think in terms of staff, I think with staff you can improve trainings, but you can also simplify the cybersecurity documentation that they're currently working with. They're using centralized documentation that spans hundreds of pages. They're fairly dry, not very interesting. And I think you can make trainings that are more engaging.
Yeah.
So instead of just trying to pass off a document to staff that probably have other responsibilities other than cybersecurity, they're probably responsible for IT and system infrastructure. You could focus on cybersecurity through engaging trainings, and those could be digital trainings. They don't have to be personal trainings, so they can scale better.
Chairman Richmond recently convened this committee to address the lack of diversity in our talent pipeline for the cybersecurity field. We touched on the need for gender diversity in particular, but as you know, that there's a real significant number of unfilled cybersecurity jobs across the country. So Mr. Duffy, do you have any feedback or ideas for what Congress and the federal government can do to attract more skilled cybersecurity professionals, particularly from diverse backgrounds?
Yeah, one of the things you need to do is certainly identify those individuals that may have not thought they had a talent in cybersecurity. We work closely with the SANS Institute and with the governors around the country for something called the Cyber Start program. This is something that's basically industry funded. 26 governors participated in this past year. And what the program is, the schools develop these programs where I try to identify individuals who may not have an interest in technology but have a real aptitude. So how do they go about finding those folks that have an aptitude but not the interest? And that's what the program is about. It's the third year of the program. The first year of the program, they shouldn't be surprised, like 85% of the participants were boys. So in year 2, they did it for girls only because they wanted to deal with the gender issue. So this year they have a combination, one program that is for the boys and the girls, but yet a second program just for the girls only because they're trying to work on that gender issue.
Excellent. Well, it's my hope that as we have models like this that private industry is supporting, that we can count on the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to develop innovative programs to help states and local officials who don't have expertise and maybe who don't have a local private company to sponsor something in their community. This is something that's important everywhere, and we want to make sure that we're properly prepared. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing, and I yield back.
The gentlelady from Illinois yields back. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. I would ask unanimous consent to insert into the record written testimony in today's hearing from Talib Kareem of STEM for Us, Inc. Without objection, the committee record should be kept open for 10 days. Hearing no further business, the committee stands adjourned.